To be joining you here for our live stream event today. So the way this works is I usually do a content drop, and then at the end, I try to address as many questions as I can within the time we have. So as you're watching, if you would like to just type your questions in the chat as they arise, I will try to set aside some time at the end so that I can be sure to address them. So today, we are going to be talking about 6 effective tips communicating with our avoidant partners. And so let me guess. You want to know how to effectively communicate with your avoidant partner. Bonus points if you could also find a way to build a healthy and meaningful relationship with passion and intimacy. But maybe it hasn't happened yet, because no matter how hard you try, things never seem to pan out the way that you want them to. Maybe they ignore you or take their frustrations out on you. Maybe they refuse to engage in meaningful conversations. And that leaves you feeling frustrated, helpless, hopeless, and even a little bit cynical. It might also sap your motivation because you're convinced that you're just going to fail before you've even begun. Well, if this sounds like you are going to love this segment, because we're going to talk about these 6 effective communication tips. And these tips, they are going to help you get faster results without having to convince or strong arm your partner into caring. Now, if you stick with me until the end, you will feel empowered, motivated, and relieved to know that there are strategies that can help you improve your communication with our Rolling Stone avoidant partners. I also invite you to take the communication quiz in the caption of this video. It's going to help you maximize your results with these steps if you decide to put them into action. And if you decide you'd like to take the quiz, you can do that by clicking the link in the caption of this video. Now, before we get started, if you are new to my online platform, welcome. My name is Brianna, and I am a licensed and board-certified creative arts therapist. I've been in the field for about 15 years, helping adults struggling with insecure attachment styles go from self-doubting to self-sovereign, so they can cultivate those soul-shaking, passionate partnerships that they want. And I do this using my trademark method, which is an attachment and trauma-informed somatic approach to healing attachment styles through a spiritual framework. Now, if you like what you see and hear today, make sure that you like, subscribe, or follow along for more related topics. I take all comments into consideration for future video topics like this, as well as for live stream Q&As, and I wouldn't want you to miss out. So with that, let's just dive right into our topic for today. And first, I'd like to talk about, why do avoidant partners struggle with communication? Well, partners with avoidant attachment tend to have difficulty with emotional intimacy, and they may struggle to express their feelings and their needs openly. And that can make it really challenging to have intimate communications with them for several reasons. So, for example, avoidantly attached individuals often have a fear of being vulnerable or exposing their emotions. They may feel that expressing their feelings is going to make them appear weak or dependent and lead to some kind of rejection or abandonment or failure. And so as a result, they may avoid discussing intimate topics, or they're reluctant to share their deepest thoughts and feelings. Also, there are issues of distrust. So avoidantly attached individuals may have had negative experiences in the past that have caused them to be mistrustful of others. And so this lack of trust can make it difficult for them to open up and be vulnerable with their partners, leading to a lack of intimate communication. They also have a tendency to use emotional distance in a relationship to find safety, which leads to withdrawing from their partners. And that can make it difficult for their partner to connect with them on those deeper levels and have meaningful conversations. Avoidant partners also respond to specific strategies in communication. So, for example, they may prefer to communicate indirectly or using nonverbal cues, whereas their partners may prefer direct verbal communication or being more explicit in what they're trying to express. So avoidant partners also respond better to what are called soft strategies, whereas anxious partners, in comparison, respond better to safe strategies. And we'll talk more about this in a minute. And so overall, having intimate communications with an avoidantly attached partner can be challenging due to their fears of vulnerability, difficulty in trusting others, putting emotional distance between themselves and a partner, as well as having a different type of communication style. So because of that, it may require patience, understanding, and support to build those deeper connections and establish open and honest communication. Now, if you want to learn more about avoidant partners, I invite you to check out the video on my YouTube channel, Avoidant Attachment 101, and that will help you increase your understanding. Now, let's just dive into our 6 tips that are going to help you help your partner come out of their shell if and when they are ready. So, our first tip, this is to focus on the present. So the first effective communication tip is to focus on the present moment. Okay. Avoid confrontational questions that look to assign blame or point out mistakes from the past. Instead, you want to ask your partner open-ended questions that focus on their current state of being, their feelings, their needs, or desires. And you can do this by noting obvious shifts in their behavior, their body language, and doing this without being overly doting, probing, or analytical. So for example, instead of saying, I can tell you're upset, it's probably connected to your childhood issues. I wish you'd talk about your feelings so I can know how to make you feel better. Instead of saying that, you might try, I noticed that you just crossed your arms and looked away. I'd love to know what's on your mind. Maybe I can help. So this is going to help your partner focus on what's going on inside their bodies in the present moment and not feeling so overwhelmed by the weight of the past. Also, avoidant partners are typically more comfortable discussing their thoughts rather than their feelings, even if their thoughts might betray their feelings. Now, this statement also suggests that you are available to help, but you're not assuming responsibility for fixing their problems, which an avoidant partner would likely find invasive or smothering. Okay, so now let's talk about the second tip. So tip number 2 is active listening. Now, active listening involves paying close attention to what your partner is saying, validating their feelings, and then responding accordingly. So it's listening to understand as opposed to listening to find out how you might fix the problem for them, right? Or tell them what to do. So instead, you want to provide a calm presence that allows your partner to feel safe enough to open up about their innermost thoughts and feelings, and that's going to allow them to come to their own conclusions. So an example of listening to fix the problem might sound like, I can see you're frustrated and upset. I wish you'd talk to me. It would make you feel better. An example of listening to understand might sound like, I can only imagine what you must be feeling right now. What do you suppose your options are? Now, in the second example, you're not assuming that you know what they're feeling, but you are trying to imagine it, and that demonstrates care. You're also inquiring about their own assessment of the situation, which helps them to feel empowered and as if you trust and respect their judgment. Okay, so let's take a look at tip number 3. So tip number 3 is to be aware of the difference between empathy and sympathy. Okay, so we want to use empathy instead of sympathy when we are communicating with our avoidant partners. So sympathy involves feeling sorry for someone, which can come across as kind of condescending and patronizing in the eyes of someone who is more avoidant in nature. On the other hand, empathy involves understanding and sharing feelings without feeling sorry for them or trying to fix their problems. So here's an example of sympathy. I'm sorry you're having a hard time. Let me help you. Now, depending on the intonation, for someone who's more avoidant, this can sound like a patronizing assessment and claiming, sort of asserting that they don't know what they're doing or they can't handle the situation on their own. And to an avoidant partner, that's going to sound like you're questioning their agency, no matter how nice you say it. It also might feel like you're trying to ingratiate yourself to them in a moment of vulnerability. And that is going to stimulate their defenses, and it's going to compel them to push you further away. So here's an empathic statement. Oh, man, that would be tough on anyone. If you need anything, I'm here for you. Now, in this case, you're normalizing any difficulty that they might be experiencing. You're also presuming that they can handle the situation by trusting their assessment of what they need and giving them the option to choose to invite you to help them or not. They may not ask for help, but they will know that you are there, and more often than not, that's all the help that an avoidant partner needs. And tip number 4, be understanding. So the 4th tip is connected to active listening, and this focuses on listening to understand instead of trying to be understood. So this means that your goal should be to understand where your partner is coming from instead of pushing them to understand where you are coming from. And this can be really difficult, especially if you have very different ways of expressing yourself, and it will take some practice, but focusing on understanding each other is going to foster that deeper sense of connection and trust in the relationship. So here's an example of seeking to be understood. I'm so frustrated that you don't understand what I'm saying. And here's an example of seeking to understand and still expressing your feelings. I'm feeling frustrated right now, but I want to understand. Can you tell me what you don't like about this and how I might say it differently so you can hear it? Notice that when you express yourself in this way, you are still finding ways to get what you're feeling across, while at the same time being able to understand how they can receive it, right? So tip number 5. This has to do with boundaries. So our 5th tip is to set clear boundaries around communication. Now, avoidant partners tend to be more comfortable when there are clear limits set around how much time and energy is spent discussing things, especially emotionally charged topics. So you want to be sure to let your partner know that you're not trying to control them or demand things from them. Instead, your goal is to create a safe space where they can express themselves without judgment, and you will listen in order to understand, right? So an example of providing your partner clear limits versus being vague and demanding is saying something like, I know it can be tough talking about our emotions, but if we could find time to talk for 10 to 15 minutes tomorrow evening, that would help me feel connected to you and less alone in this, right? Instead of saying, you never listen to me and you better listen to me right now or we're over, right? So when we add in specific detail, this is what we call positive action language. It clearly sets out expectations for the conversation that your partner can understand and agree to. It's also very specific in a time frame so that your partner has a clear understanding of when it will end, okay? So this approach is more effective than demanding that they open up without setting any boundaries or limitations on the conversation, or approaching them at inopportune moments and then feeling upset when they respond negatively. Like maybe right after they got off to work and they're trying to zone out in front of the TV, or maybe they're in the middle of a passion project and you approach them with a highly charged subject. These are inopportune times to approach your partner and you're not going to get an effective result. Okay. Now, of course, there is always the possibility that they will intentionally avoid you during the time that you set aside for this conversation, in which case you also need to establish real consequences for not following through on their agreements with you. Okay. So with that, I would love to know, I'm just going to pause there before our last tip. And I'd like to ask if you have tried any of these things before and how did it go? Or if you're more avoidant, how would you respond to this approach, right? I'd love to know how you're responding to this in the comments there. Now, after these first 5 steps, you might start to notice some improvement in the communication between you and your partner, but maybe you're still struggling to understand your partner's values and perspective. So that leaves me to the last tip, our 6th tip, which is radical acceptance. Now, practicing radical acceptance means accepting your partner without judgment. Okay, it doesn't mean anything about assessing the long-term compatibility of the relationship. That comes later. Right now, we're just practicing accepting them as they are in this moment. So practically speaking, in communication, this might involve using something like a soft startup. And that means approaching difficult conversations or topics with a gentle, non-confrontational tone and manner that doesn't trigger defensiveness in your partner. So that means avoiding using things like criticism, contempt, or defensiveness, because those can quickly escalate the conversation. Instead, you want to focus on what you need rather than attacking them for not giving you what you want. So for example, instead of saying, you never listen to me, you might say, I'm feeling lonely and voiceless right now. Would you be willing to listen to me for a few moments and connect with me? Also, you want to be willing to accept that they may never understand your perspective or your feelings, but that doesn't mean that they don't care, and it doesn't mean that the relationship can't work. Because what's more important than understanding? Caring, acceptance, respect, compassion, and a lot of other things. So feeling seen and understood is valuable, but it's not the most important thing. especially considering that understanding doesn't necessarily equal validation or agreement. So we can learn to accept, care for, and respect someone that we don't fully understand. We can validate that the other person's experience is just as real and as important as our own without really comprehending the hows or the whys. In fact, an ability to do this and to communicate this is really imperative for a long-term relationship, especially if insecure attachment styles are involved. Now, because if you prioritize understanding in a relationship above all these other qualities, guess what happens? You might accept things like disrespect or a lack of caring from someone that just gets you, but doesn't really care. There's a lot of people who can understand your conundrum, but just don't care, right? So deprioritize understanding and instead lead with acceptance and caring, all right? And then you don't have to sacrifice things like self-respect for understanding again. Instead, you're going to experience the many benefits of improved communication. So for example, there will be increasing trust between the two of you, being solution focused rather than problem obsessed, having more meaningful conversations, and increased emotional intimacy. Okay. So I'm going to pause there also and ask, let me know in the comments, have you ever made excuses for a partner because you felt like they understood you, even though they were actually not so caring and they didn't prioritize you in their lives, right? So how was that experience for you? Okay. So with that, I'm going to move on to some final thoughts. Okay. Now, these 6 tips, I'm just going to review them one more time. Number 1, you're going to focus on the present moment. Number 2, you're going to practice active listening. Number 3, you're going to express empathy instead of sympathy. Number 4, you're going to be understanding. Number 5, you're going to set good boundaries. And number 6, you're going to practice radical acceptance. Now, if you would like to learn about more communication tips like this, I invite you to check out the video on my YouTube channel. It's called 8 Triggers for Anxious and Avoidant Partners and What to Say Instead. Now, one last distinction that I would like to add here. Radical acceptance is not an excuse for self-abandonment. So while radical acceptance may be necessary for unconditional love, you need more than unconditional love to make a long-term relationship work in the material world of human form. So unconditional love is an intangible regard and an admiration for the divine spark and spirit that exists in every human being. It is a form of transcendence. But we are spiritual beings having a physical experience. And to navigate this material world means that in selecting a primary partner, there needs to be a reciprocal balance of time, energy, values, and priorities. So in other words, you're not here to just be anyone's companion. You are here to sift and sort through life's varieties and find out what is most aligned to your soul's curriculum. That includes sussing out the true compatibility of a long-term partner, and that includes loving feelings, but a lot more than that. So to learn more about if your partner is truly compatible, I invite you to check out the playlists on my YouTube channel. There's a wealth of information there that you can dive into. But generally speaking, when you are emotionally honest and you express a willingness to be generous and compromise in a relationship, and you're using the communication tips like the ones we discussed today, and your partner responds by becoming increasingly inaccessible, demanding, defensive, or even adversarial, then they have a severity of insecure attachment that they are going to have to be working with on their own and internally before they can step into that shared space with you in earnest. Okay. And evidence-based research has borne this out. But what you can do is you can be tactfully aware of how you're articulating yourself in consideration of your partner's triggers. You can know and trust that you are voicing your most authentic experience in the moment because you've done your homework and you've been practicing compassionate communication skills. You can make every effort to create a safe environment for your partner to feel invited to show up in a real way. But what you cannot do is force them to meet you on the same page. All you can do is create the possibility for that. They have to be willing to accept that invitation. If they do not, then that's very good information for you regarding what is possible with respect to long-term compatibility with this person. And once you know that for sure, now you have an opportunity to find creative solutions for what is really going to get your needs met. So I hope that these tips have been helpful and that you can incorporate some of them into your experience. If you did like today's content, please be sure to leave a comment or stay tuned for our next installment. We are going to be talking about 6 effective communication tips with anxious partners. Now, I also, again, encourage you to check out the quiz in the caption of this video. This is a communication styles quiz, and it's going to help you find out if insecure attachment styles may be affecting the health of your relationships. And so with that, thank you for those of you that joined me for this live segment. I hope that you have a wonderful day. For those of you that are going to stick around for a little bit, we can commit some time for some Q&A, and I'm just going to hop on over here into the Q&A section. Let's see, maybe I can pull the questions up on the screen. Not yet. Okay, let's see. Why do we have to, why do we have to learn about avoidant ways of being when they're not giving all that in return? So when I hear that question, right? When I hear that question, what it lets me know is that there's a resentment growing inside of you, right? I'm not getting what I deserve. I'm trying to earn the love that I get, and I'm not getting the brownie points that I'm earning. Where are my rewards? They're not doing it, so I'm not going to do it, right? So this is first of all, there's an active part inside of you that's probably pretty wounded, that is struggling to prove its worth and value. And there's something very tender there. And when we have that going on inside of us, we're going to feel attracted to partners who have the same thing going on inside of them, right? And so the way that we heal that is twofold, working on the inner space and working in the outer space, but it starts with the inner space. So I would actually recommend that you check out my playlist on healing the wounded inner child, where we talk about parts work and integration. Once you process that resentment you've got going on, then you're going to be able to release that, and you're going to be able to show up to any partnership, any person, and not take whatever they are able or not able to give you personally, right? And it's not going to get caught up in your ideas of what I deserve in this, right? Because deservedness is an ego construction. It's a human construction, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we can't hold people accountable for their behaviors, or that we can't establish consequences when people interfere with our boundaries, right? Or when people don't respect our boundaries. But applying consequences to boundaries is different than things like ultimatums, is different than acting out with the same energy that you're annoyed with, right? So I would say check out my playlist on healing the wounded inner child. I'm going to go a lot more in depth with this, because it's about healing that relationship to yourself. And once you're able to do that, when someone doesn't reciprocate, you're not going to get so flared up. You're just going to be like, oh, thank you. Thank you for showing me what you're capable of. And no judgment around that. I see the degree to which you can show up to this relationship. And I know that that's not for me. So thanks. And I wish you well, right? No flare up. Why can't you do what I do? Right? Why can't you give me what I'm giving you? You don't, it's not a problem of checks and balances, right? That's very different than establishing a boundary, right? So what I'm looking for in relationship is someone who is communicative, who shares their feelings, who's able to show up for me in times of distress. Can you do that? Is that a relationship that you're interested in? If so, then I can tell you what I'd like to hear right now. Or I'd be really interested to find out how you can contribute on your own. But if you're not going to show up in this way, then I'm going to have to evaluate my investment here. Very different than a sort of, riled up ultimatum, right? So you have to look at the energy that you're expressing in that, okay? Now, again, next week, I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about effective tips for communicating with anxious partners. So we're going to be tackling both sides of this. Okay. I struggle with a sense of panic after emotionally charged conversations, regardless of how it went. Do you have suggestions for what to do post-conversation to alleviate this? Okay, so that's about nervous system regulation. Okay, so if emotional honesty and vulnerable conversations have been threatening for you in the past for whatever reason, when you attempt to do these things, it's going to trigger your nervous system. It's going to mobilize your sympathetic nervous system, and you're going to feel compelled towards fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, but it's going to, either way, it's going to feel like a sense of anxiety and activation in your body. So in that moment, you wanted to assume somatic approaches to calming the nervous system. Not necessarily, I want to maybe tweak that. Regulation, nervous system regulation is not just, it can be part of, but it's not just calming the nervous system, right? Because a lot of times insecure folks will hear that and they think they have to suppress something. Calming is suppressing, right? No, not necessarily. Regulation is an ability to sort of expand like a rubber band and hold the discomfort you feel in the moment without allowing it to swamp you, right? Without allowing it to take over your mind and start making assumptions about the meanings of things, right? So regulation is about being aware of how to expand and open up and create some spaciousness and lean into difficult feelings and allow them on their way, and then come back to a sense of stasis, right? Being inside that window of tolerance so that you can exist with a range of human emotion, right? So I guess maybe I should ask, when you say what to do with that post conversation, I would say I know that this is going to be a conversation that I have to have and that I want to have from a place of authenticity and honesty. And I also know that those are difficult conversations for me. So I'm going to plan for, after this conversation, self-care activities, maybe some deactivating breath work, maybe activating breath work if you really want to lean in, maybe some movement, maybe a bath with candles, whatever it is that's going to allow you to let that energy be on its way without assigning any additional meaning to it, right? This is just my constitution, and it's okay for me to, it's okay for that to be my story, right? It's okay for that to be how I feel, because that means that I am rising to this challenge, and bit by bit and little by little, my tolerance, my window of tolerance is going to expand, and over time it will get easier, because that part of me that gets stimulated and activated in that moment of threat is going to realize and recognize that I'm going to care for it during and after these conversations. So I'm slipping into parts work again. I would also go back, and the playlist on my channel for healing attachment or healing the wounded inner child will help with this as well. Thank you for this. Now I have a roadmap. I'm so glad that you liked that. I've learned so much about this relationship dynamic. What I realize, let's see, I'll pull this up a little bit bigger. I've learned so much about this relationship dynamic for a month, and what I realize is this is all for me and my future relationship. I'm anxious, preoccupied, and in no contact with my dismissive avoidant partner for 20 days. Yeah. You might like, I do have a video on my YouTube channel called No Contact, Does It Work? You might find that helpful, but there are a variety of other videos on my YouTube channel about the anxious avoidant trap. And that's a playlist on the front facing page when you land on the channel, which you might find helpful. Thank you for sharing that. Where have all the healthily attached men gone? So this is the thing. When we have an insecure attachment style, it's likely because we grew up and have been moving through environments in which and social systems and social communities, family, extended family, whatnot, that have been struggling with these things, right? And so, and we are trained, we are socialized just in general to focus on our environments and the cues from other people around us to dictate how we will evolve, right? To the evolution of our personalities and our identities. Usually that is, at least for my audience, until there's a catalytic experience in your life, usually of great loss or grief. And that's with my audience, usually it's a romantic loss or grief experience, but it could be other forms of grief and loss as well, that force us through the profundity of that emotional experience to turn inwards and start asking more deeper self-reflective questions of ourselves. And as we start to do that, what happens is we become increasingly a mismatch for the people and the environments that we find ourselves in. Because your environments and the partners that you've had up until this point are a reflection of whom you have been. They are a manifestation of the energy that you have been inhabiting and expressing up until this point. Now you reach this catalytic moment and you're like, oh, you look around, you ask yourself deep questions, and then now you look out around yourself and you're like, oh my God, I'm surrounded by XYZ, right? I suddenly have this moment of insight. And that insight is useful because it's like a first step along the way, but then the insight starts to beat you up, because when you have a profound insight, that means that you're on the cusp of changing something. And change is scary, especially when we don't know what's on the other side of it. So now we have all our protector parts, and we have all these old programs that have habitual programs that have been created to keep you safe. Now they start coming to the surface, and then they're going to take hold of your insight. And they're going to say, oh, now I see that everyone around me is insecure and unhealthy and toxic. And oh my God, nobody's healthy. But you're just looking at the life that you've manifested and the water that you've been swimming in up until this point. You just got to poke your head above water, right? So it's like we're fish swimming in a fishbowl, and someone shows you that there's a world beyond it. But it's really hard to see that world beyond if we only have been swimming in circles our whole lives, right? So in many ways, it starts by making the conscientious decision to visualize and reach for and intentionally look for, where's the evidence to support that the idea that there are healthy partners out there? Because if you don't make the effort, it's not going to just show up. Because if you're a lazy manifester, you're just going to expect, oh, I want this now, so it should show up. And it doesn't show up. And so you're like, oh, well, it's not showing up for me, so it doesn't exist. Lazy manifestation, right? Because we're not making the effort to intentionally focus our mind and our intentions and our energy on what it is that we do want, bringing that into being. This is the manifesting current of energy, okay? So if you know that if you have an insecure attachment style, I'll tell you right now, it's likely you've grown up in systems that foster insecure attachment. So what does that mean? You got to stick your head above water. And that takes effort. It does take effort. It means going against decades of habitual unconscious programming. But it does work. Those things do exist out there. And, it's sort of like, so your attachment style will create a lens for you. It will say, hey, it's as if I were to say to you, look around the room and tell me all of the red things you see. Show me all the red flags, right? And you might now look around the room and you're going to count up all the red things, and you're going to say, Brianna, I saw 10 red things. And I'll say, fine, but did you see any blue things? And you're going to say, blue things? You told me to find red things. And I said, okay, does that mean that there are no blue things? Well, I don't know. I might have seen 1 or 2 blue things out of the corner of my eye, but I wasn't looking for it because you told me not to. You told me to look at the red things. This is what our attachment styles do. They tell you what to look for. So that's what we look for. So now you're going to have to tell yourself to look for something else. Don't just accept what is presented to you. And then you will start to see the blue things. And as you look for the blue things, you'll see more and more and more and more of them. And the blue things in this metaphor are healthy relationships, opportunities, right? This is all about cognitive reframing. Okay. So with that, I'm going to probably end our live stream here today, but I look forward to coming back. We're going to talk more about 6 effective tips for communicating with anxious partners, and that will be on Thursday of this week at same time. So thank you for joining me here today, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of days.